If I stand here, is it still going to be possible?
You are good, yes.
Okay, thank you. Let the words of my mouth and the meditations of our hearts be always acceptable in your sight, O Lord, our strength and our Redeemer. Amen. Much as I love Holy Week, I have always found this particular day a bit jarring. Here we are welcoming Jesus into Jerusalem, welcoming him into our midst, and we all know that within a week's time, we will be yelling, "Crucify him, crucify him." And I'm trying through the years to figure out, is this just the fickleness of human nature, or what is actually going on here, that the very people who welcome Jesus, or at least some of the ones who were calling on him to be crucified? And I think it has a great deal more to do, not so much with fickleness as with dashed perceptions, misunderstandings of who he is, and also coupled with disappointments in our own personal lives. All three of the synoptic gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, present Jesus entering Jerusalem at the very end of their gospels, just before the crucifixion. And all three of them have the cleansing of the temple happen right after the story that Amy read outside. And that cleansing all seems so natural to us because we're used to it, but we don't always recognize that it was an act of civil disobedience. We think of the fact that Jesus is calling upon the temple to be a place of prayer and not to be a place of commerce, but in fact, Jewish law required it to be both a place of prayer and of commerce, and the commerce was in fact controlled by the Roman government. The Romans sold franchises, much as you might buy a franchise to open at McDonald's here in Glenwood. I'm not suggesting that, but there'll probably be a number of petitions against that, I think, and I might sign them. But it was a franchised experience. If you were a money changer, you had a franchise from the Roman government. If you were selling doves, even though they were used for religious purposes, you had a franchise. And so this act of driving these people out of the temple isn't just an offense, perhaps, to the temple leaders. It is also alarming to the Romans. It's also very true that although Jesus in the Gospels is persecuted by the temple officials, in reality, he dies a distinctively Roman death. Crucifixion was used by the Romans largely to punish persons who were guilty of insurrection. It's not hard to imagine that if we welcome Jesus as king, the Romans would get a bit alarmed about this new king arriving in Jerusalem when Herod was their king according to Roman rule. It's also fair to say that the Gospels were all written decades after Jesus' death in a time when Christians were being persecuted by the Romans for their faith. The Jews were grandfathered in. It was understood by the Romans that the Jews had one God, and therefore they would not fall down and worship Caesar. But it was not grandfathered that the Christians, who were an offshoot of Judaism, should be granted the same thing. And they were being persecuted. So it's my hunch that the gospel writers go out of their way to save the Romans from receiving the blame, because they're writing these gospels after all. These are pretty chargeable offenses. Had they made the Romans guilty, instead the poor Jewish people become the guilt bearers of the crucifixion of Jesus. But I think it's really the Romans. And it's not that I'm trying to find fault. I'm just trying to explain what may be going on. It's very interesting. About a month ago, Nancy and I went to the Kennedy Center to see the 50th anniversary of Jesus Christ Superstar, Andrew Lloyd Webber's very famous rock opera, which actually I think has rather good theology. I'm so old that I realized, Nancy and I realized, that we had been at the premiere of this 50 years ago in New York, and I was a priest back then. So we actually took a group of people from Connecticut, from Fairfield County, Connecticut, down to New York to see Jesus Christ Superstar. And I was reminded again that Judas Iscariot, who is roundly criticized, especially in Luke and John, the two later Gospels written, is portrayed as a real villain. But in fact, I suspect, as Andrew Lloyd Webber kind of makes clear in the rock opera, that Judas was not motivated by something dishonest, but by an honest desire to force Jesus' hand. If he could only force Jesus to, in fact, be the Messiah he wanted and many of the people wanted, that would be a good thing. But of course, it's very possible that the Messiah he wanted was someone to free them from Roman rule. And that had little to do with Jesus' agenda. As he made clear in his trial, when he says that he has a kingdom, but it's not of this world. And the reason it's not of this world is it isn't a kingdom of violence, a kingdom of power. It's a kingdom of powerlessness, a kingdom of love. But he's misunderstood. So I suspect a lot of what causes the shift of attitude between people on Palm Sunday and Good Friday is they were expecting, as perhaps Judas Iscariot was, that this was the Messiah who was going to free them from Rome. And of course, they're not the only ones who are guilty. Many Christians also abandon the faith because they're expecting a different kind of Messiah. As a parish priest for many years, I realized that I had parishioners who simply could not understand how after so much earnest prayer, a loved one had died. Or after so much earnest prayer, someone was not spared a debilitating disease. And they become disillusioned in their Messiah. It's even more normally the case that people begin to realize, I don't think I really want to, I don't think they maybe consciously think this, but they may not want to do the work that is required to be a Christian. There are easier avenues to seek comfort in material goods, or in our success, or in a variety of worldly ways. We can find our messiahs in various places in the world. Jesus calls us to a much tougher road. If we are Jesus's disciples, then we need to be making self-sacrifices for the good of others. We need to be conscious of our social responsibility for the poverty of our neighbors and for reaching out in loving ways to people who we don't even like. We have to find ways to really extend ourselves, to try to respect all other persons as loved human beings, loved children of God, even though we may find it extremely difficult, if not impossible, to even like them. So it's not so much that in our age we see people turning on Jesus and getting angry with him, but they get disillusioned, which is pretty much the same thing. They give up. I hope that this Holy Week for you will be a time of really walking with Jesus in a way that you can internalize the kingdom that he offers you, and the way in which joy and peace are byproducts of that sacrifice, the sacrifice he makes on the cross, but the sacrifices we make for others in his name. And since we'll be using, this is just a little addendum of added trivia, which I decided I'm just going to do it in this. I probably won't do it. I didn't do it earlier. I probably won't do it for the next service, but just because I love Bible study. Luke is the gospel we're reading this year. And I encourage you to read the story of Jesus's trial and crucifixion in Luke, because there are some unique things. Luke is the only gospel writer that tries to put a good face on Pontius Pilate. You know, the creed says, Jesus was crucified under Pontius Pilate, which is very true. And historians have pointed out that Pontius Pilate was an atrocious ruler of Judea. He only lasted 10 years there, and the Roman government finally got rid of him because he was so awful. But in the Gospel of Luke, there are things that try to make he and his wife, that is, Pilate and his wife, look good. In that gospel, she has this dream of, this is a good man, have nothing to do with him. And she tells her husband, and he washes his hands publicly. This has led the Eastern Orthodox Church to actually declare that Pontius Pilate and his wife are saints. That, when I learned that, I cringed, and I still cringe to say it. Fortunately, that has never happened in the West. But just for the record, I just want to say that Pontius Pilate was not a saint, and neither was his wife, and that quite likely Pontius Pilate was happy to go along with the crowds and not to be resistant in the least. So as you read some of these things, be aware of the fact that that gospel is written in the height of Neronian persecution. And so the gospel writer has a vested interest in making the Romans look good. But in fact, it's a minor thing and it is trivia. The more important thing is finding meat in these stories of Holy Week that give you new life and bring you to a joyous Easter. Amen.
Amen.